we know if an economy is flourishing or is down in the dumps? How can economists predict recessions or periods of economic boom? Lucky for you, we are here to answer all of those questions in today's review video. How's it going, AP Macro class? Today we are going to talk about Unit 2, which is going to be economic indicators and the business cycle. In this review, we are going to touch base upon all of our major topics tested from Unit 2 by the College Board. In this video, we are going to start off with the business cycle and talk a little bit about the upward and downward trends of the economy. From there, we're going to move to gross domestic product, where we are going to take a look at what GDP is exactly and how we can calculate it. We will then take a look at unemployment, the different types of unemployment, and how to calculate the unemployment rate. From there, we will take a look at inflation and CPI. So what exactly is the consumer price index, and what are some of the causes of inflation, and how exactly does the purchasing power of the dollar decrease? So as always, please remember that this review is just that, a review to serve as a guide for you to get refreshed on important terms and concepts from each unit. So please use it as such. If there's something that I talk about during this review that you think, I'm a little confused about that, go to your textbook, try some of the practice problems I've posted, email me, whatever. It doesn't matter as long as you take the initiative to try and understand the concepts that you might not be too comfortable with right now. Anyways, let's get started. Before we jump right into the business cycle, I do want to spend some time quickly going over the circular flow model in more detail. Remember, the circular flow model is going to represent the flow of goods and money between two parts of the economy. These two parts of the economy are going to be the product market and the factor market. The product market is just where households are going to buy their goods and services. So when you go to the mall with your friend and you go into a clothes store and buy something, that is you participating in the product market. The factor market is going to be where businesses and firms buy the factors of production. So remember, the factors of production are going to be land, labor, and capital. Business and firms specifically look for labor from workers and capital goods for production. So if any of you have a job, you are considered part of labor and are participating in the factor market. Also part of the circular flow model, you see that we have households, firms, and the government. Well, how exactly are these three things going to affect the factor and product market? Households demand goods and services in the product market while they supply the factors of production to the resource market. Households are also going to pay taxes to the government, but in return they do receive some transfer payments. Households are also going to receive different provisions such as public goods. These are going to be things like road construction or having a police department and fire department. Firms are going to produce the goods and services that are consumed by households, and firms also pay taxes to the government and in return enjoy public goods and services. The government is going to collect taxes from households and firms while redistributing this income through transfer payments and the provisions of public goods to the entire nation. The business cycle is going to be a cycle of economic expansion and contraction. Economic growth is not going to be permanent. It can change from day to day and year to year. Every single economy in the world has three economic goals. 1, to promote long-term economic growth. 2, to keep inflation at a stable level. And 3, to prevent excessive unemployment. The government and the Federal Reserve is going to have the goal of tightening the business cycle, so basically keeping it as close to potential GDP as possible. The business cycle is going to show our growth of real GDP over time. In the business cycle, we have 4 parts. We have an expansionary gap, which is also going to be known as a recovery. This is when we see economic output increase and unemployment decrease. On the reverse end of this, we have a recessionary gap. This is where we're going to see output decrease and unemployment start to increase. Looking at the business cycle, we can also identify peaks and troughs. A peak is going to be the highest point in the business cycle. This is when the economy is producing at maximum output and employment is at or above full employment. A trough is going to be the lowest point of economic production in the business cycle. This is where economic output is very low and the unemployment is very high. Economists can generally tell if we're headed to a period of recession or expansion. However, we generally don't know if we're in a trough or a peak until after the fact. Next, we're going to talk about how the business cycle directly correlates with the production productions possibilities curve. All right, so here we have a model of the business cycle and the productions possibilities curve. At point A in our business cycle, we are located right on the potential output line of the business cycle. Our corresponding point on the production possibilities curve will be at full employment. So this is when our economy is producing at its most efficiently. What we're going to do next is add another curve to our productions possibility curve. This curve is going to be above our full employment curve, and we're going to label this curve 0% unemployment. Now, 0% unemployment is technically unattainable. We will never actually be able to reach this point, but there will be some times in our business cycle where we're in between the 0% unemployment and full employment. Point B on both the business cycle and the productions possibilities curve is going to show our economy in an expansionary gap. Remember, this is where unemployment is low and our output is starting to increase. Now, let's just focus on our business cycle model for a second. Since our x-axis shows over time, if we are at an expansionary gap, such as point B, what has to happen next? Well, following the business cycle, we will start to see a decrease in output. At point C, on both the business cycle and the production possibilities curve, we see the economy in a recessionary gap. This is where unemployment is rising and output is decreasing. Arguably the most important measure of economic growth. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is going to be the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy during a given period of time, generally a year or so. There are going to be two ways that the College Board tests you on calculating GDP. This is going to be the income approach and the expenditure approach. We're going to start with the expenditure approach. The word expenditure in itself means the act of spending. The expenditure approach is going to measure the GDP by adding up all the spending we have done on final goods and services in a given year. How does the expenditure approach go about calculating GDP? What we do is, first, we take all the consumer expenditures. These are going to be things that your normal everyday consumer is spending money on. So buying a new cell phone or getting your hair cut, any type of good or service. We then take investment, which is going to be the investment into any capital goods. This is not like investing into the stock market, purchasing a government-backed security, or investing into a private company. Rather, it's a company investing into its own infrastructure. Picture a company such as Boeing, which produces airplanes, and they need a new software for their planes. So what they do is they hire Microsoft to produce this software for them, and then they purchase the software from Microsoft. That would be considered investment spending because Boeing would be using its funds to reinvest back into its company. We then look for the total amount of money that the government spent on goods and services, so government expenditure. When the government spends money on something such as internet for the White House, that amount will go into GDP. However, this does not include transfer payments made by the government, such as subsidies and unemployment payments. Then we're going to look for net exports. Net exports are just going to be the value of all the country's exports subtracted by the cost of all of their imports. Net exports can be positive or negative depending on how much a country imports or exports goods. Now that we've identified the components of the expenditure approach, you now have been introduced to one of the most important formulas in macroeconomics. GDP, or Y, equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So consumer expenditures plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports will give us a nation's gross domestic product. So to calculate GDP using the expenditure approach, all we have to do is identify those factors and add all of them up. So let's take a look at an example. In our table here, we see that we have $1,000 of consumer spending, $200 in investment spending, $500 in government spending, $75 in imports, $50 in exports, and $50 in transfer payments. So oftentimes in the AP test, you are given a graph with information and are asked to calculate GDP. So we're going to do just that. To find GDP, first, I like to start off with the net export. According to our table, we imported $75. So that is $75 we spent in another economy, while individuals outside of our economy spent $50 on our goods and services, giving us an export total of $50. Since we imported $25 more in goods than we exported, our net export is going to be negative $25, which is going to actually subtract from our total GDP. We then follow the formula and take $1,000 $1,000 of consumer spending plus $200 of investment spending, and then for government spending we add $500. We now have a total of $1,700. We then take away the $25 for our trade deficit, and that leaves us with a GDP of $1,675. Notice how we did nothing with that transfer payment amount. Remember, transfer payments are not going to be part of GDP. Sometimes the test is going to provide you with information that you do not need to properly solve the question. This is just going to be to try and throw you off. So it's very important to make sure we are following the right formula that the question asks. The other method of calculating GDP is going to be the income approach. The income approach calculates GDP by adding up all the income earned by factors of production in the economy. To calculate the income approach, we take wages, interest, rent, and profit and add them all together. Wages are just going to be the take-home money from employees. So when they get their paycheck every 2 weeks or every week, that is going to be wages. Interest is going to be the money made by people who are investing in different firms or businesses. Rent is going to be for those who lease their land or structures to firms and businesses and make a profit off of it, while profit is just going to be the money that firms make by selling goods and services. So in this graph, we have an example of calculating the income approach. To calculate our income approach, first we're going to take wages, interest, rent, and profit and just add up all of these numbers. In this scenario, we end up with $492. However, we're not done just yet. This number is only going to give us our net domestic product, or NDP. NDP is just the GDP minus depreciation. It's going to account for all the capital that has depreciated or lost value over time. So to make NDP turn into GDP, all we have to do is add depreciation and indirect business taxes, because these two things have no cash flow. The income approach is not going to be emphasized as much as the expenditure approach, but it's still important to know. Now, even though GDP is one of the more reliable ways to see how our economy is doing, there are still some limitations to be using it as an economic indicator. GDP does not account for intermediate goods. These are goods that are part of the final product, but not the final product itself. When Ford Motor Company buys tires from a company for their new cars, that sale is not going to count towards GDP, but the sale of the car will, since the car was the final good. Now, on the other hand, if you take your car to the mechanic to buy a new set of tires, that purchase will go to GDP because the tires were the final good or service in that situation. GDP also does not account for non-production transactions, so things like stocks, bonds, real estate transactions where an old home is going to be sold to a new resident. And lastly, GDP is not going to account for non-market and illegal activities. These are things like the selling of illegal drugs or paying a worker under the table. Now let's take a look at unemployment. Unemployment is when workers are actively looking for a job, but they are not currently working. So these are people who may have been let go from their job, quit, got fired, and they're just looking for a new job. When looking at unemployment, it is very important to understand the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is just going to be the percentage of the labor force that is currently unemployed. So I just use this term labor force. To be considered unemployed, you have to be a member of the labor force. So what exactly makes someone a member of the labor force? The labor force is going to consist of individuals above the age of 16 who are able and willing to work, not hospitalized or in jail, and they're also not in the military or a full-time student. Retirees are not members of the labor force. So when someone's searching for a job but find no luck and decide to stop searching, they are actually considered something called a discouraged worker. Discouraged workers are not counted in the unemployment rate. It is important to keep that in mind when looking at the unemployment rate numbers. Unemployment is going to be categorized in 3 different ways. Frictional unemployment is when someone is temporarily unemployed. These workers are qualified, they have transferable skills, but they just so happen to be in between work. Structural unemployment is going to be when changes in the labor force make some skills or jobs obsolete. Unfortunately for these workers, they do not have transferable skills, and these jobs will never come back. A long time ago, people would have all of their clothes sewn by hand. It would be the job of some people to sew clothes to make money for a living. When clothes started to become mass-produced, these jobs became obsolete. This is an example of frictional unemployment. Our last type of unemployment is going to be cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is going to be unemployment that is the result of a recession. As demand for goods and services fall, demand for labor falls as well, and workers are eventually let go. When an economy is operating at full employment, there will always be frictional and structural unemployment. People will always be in between jobs, or technology will always be replacing jobs. The natural rate of unemployment is going to be structural unemployment plus frictional unemployment. To be considered at full employment in the US, we need to be between 4 and 7% unemployment rate. To calculate unemployment, we take the number of people who are currently employed and divide that by the number of people in the labor force. We then multiply that number by 100 to give us our unemployment rate. Our last topic that we're going to be talking about for Unit 2 is going to be inflation and the consumer price index. Inflation is going to be rising general level of prices. When inflation is high, it is going to reduce the purchasing power of money. You might be thinking, how exactly does that affect me? Well, when the purchasing power of money decreases, you need more money to buy a product that cost you less in the past. An easy way of looking at this is when your grandparents used to tell you, oh, when I was your age, a bottle of Coke would cost me a nickel. There is some truth behind that. Looking at inflation statistics in the USA, 6 United States dollars today would have the same purchasing power as 1 United States dollar in 1970. When inflation is unanticipated, it is generally considered a bad thing, and it has different effects on different groups of people. Those people hurt by inflation are people who are going to lend money at fixed interest rate. When they receive the full payment of their loan, it will be worth less. The purchasing power of that money would have decreased as a result of the inflation. People with fixed incomes will also be hurt by inflation. Their income does not increase with inflation or the cost of living, so as inflation increases, their income remains the same, meaning their purchasing power decreases. Also, people who have been saving money or just holding on to cash will now see that their cash is worth less. Even though unanticipated inflation is considered a bad thing, it does have some consequences that end up helping people. Specifically those borrowing money. They will now have more purchasing power with the money they borrowed, and it will be easier for them to pay it back. Theoretically, of course. They could just be bad with money and go into more debt. So now you may be wondering, how exactly does inflation occur? There are going to be many different events that can cause inflation. There's demand pool inflation. This is where there are too many dollars chasing too few goods. When an economy becomes overheated with excessive spending with the same amount of goods, the demand for those goods are going to quickly outpace the supply, eventually rising the price level. Another form of inflation is going to be cost push inflation. Cost push inflation can be seen as a negative supply shock when the higher cost of production of essential resources is going to lead to higher price levels with low levels of output. Another way that inflation can occur is when the government or Federal Reserve decides to print money. As seen in Germany after World War I, in September of 1922, a loaf of bread in Germany cost 163 German marks. Just a year and a few months later, in November of 1923, inflation reached such an extreme that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion German marks. How exactly do economists measure inflation? Price indices are going to be price indexes used to calculate a change of price level. For AP Macro, we're going to look at 2 price indices: Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the GDP deflator. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the average price paid by urban consumers for a fixed market basket of goods. Based on that definition, you may be wondering what exactly a market basket is. A market basket is just going to be a hypothetical set of consumer purchases. So we may be measuring inflation of apples, peaches, and oranges from 2019 to 2020. This would be considered our market basket for that year. CPI is the most commonly used method for your average consumer to measure inflation. To calculate CPI, all we're going to do is take the price of the market basket and we're going to place that over the price of the market basket in the base year, and then we're going to multiply by 100. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when talking about CPI. The base year is always going to be 100. The base year is just the year that we're measuring a change in inflation. So let's take a look at an example. I provided a table for you right here. Let's say this was an AP question and it asks you to figure out the cost of the market basket for each year as well as the price index for each year. Using year 1 as the base year, how would we do it? Well, first we're going to add up the total price of each year's market basket. We then multiply each item's quantity by the price and add them together to get the cost of each market basket. We then take the price of each market basket and divide it by the base year's market basket of year 1 to get our price index value. So for year 2, our market basket is about $552. So what we're going to do is take that 552.3 and divide it by our base year market basket of 527. We're then going to multiply that by 100 to get a price index value of 104.8. With a base year price index of 100 and a year 2 price index of 104.8, we can now conclude that this shows an inflation rate of 4.8% between year 1 and year 2. Our other method of measuring inflation will be the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator will measure the difference between real and nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is going to be GDP at the current price level, while real GDP is GDP adjusted for inflation. Because of this, nominal GDP will oftentimes appear higher than real GDP. When price levels increase, we see inflation. When price levels decrease, we see deflation. The GDP deflator is a price index that measures the change in a price of a particular basket of goods over time. The GDP deflator just equals the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. Just like CPI, the GDP deflator will always have the base year price index of 100. All right, guys, that's it for our Unit 2 review. I hope you found some of this information helpful. Now we are on to the FRQ. Remember to upload your FRQ before Friday into Google Classrooms. If you have any questions, please let me know. Remember to keep reading your textbooks, to keep going over your notes, to keep doing those practice worksheets, and there's no doubt in my mind that you won't crush it at the AP test. See you next time. I'm outie like an R8.